So last month, um, the English grandmaster Nigel came down to Melbourne and to give a lecture and to play a simul at the Melbourne Chess Club. He also did a tour around Australia as well, playing in. I think he played in the tournament in Ballarat. I'm not sure if he played any others. So I signed up to play the simul against him, and I just wanted to show you guys the game we played. So Nigel Short, for those who don't know about him, is in 1988 he was the number 3 player in the world, behind only Karpov and Kasparov. And in fact, I think he beat Karpov in a match at one point. Um, and he's still active now. I think he's around 50 years old, and he's the current world number 77, which is quite good. He's had a very long career, and he's still extremely strong. Um, so let's just look at this game. So Nigel started with c4. So in the simul, um, he was playing against 30 players, and the final results were he won 26, 3 draws, and 1 loss in this particular simul in Melbourne. Um, so the process is that he plays white in every game, which is the traditional approach for playing a simul, and he plays a move on every single board, and then when he comes around, you must make a reply. You're not allowed to pass when he comes around again. So when he goes around the circle and he comes back to you, you must respond, and you can't move before. You have to move as he gets there, and you can't move before he gets to the table as well. So really, he only gets a few seconds to think about each move. So he's obviously nowhere near full strength. And if you think about it, it'd be fairly normal to lose a few games here and there. I've played a simul before, and it's quite hard. You only get a few seconds to make a move, and so like one way to think about it is in the 30 board simul, the players who are playing against him literally have 30 times more time to think about their move than Nigel does when he comes around. So it's quite normal to lose a game here and there, make a few draws. So let's get back to the game. Nigel opened c4, which is the English opening. I played e5. There are many responses here that have fairly good theoretical reputations. You can play c6, you can play c5, the symmetrical English. You can play e6. Normally, well, you can play e6 with the intention of playing d5, but you don't have to, I guess. You can play knight f6. You can even play like g6 or something. And they have fairly good theoretical reputations. e5 is, I think people have called it the most principled approach because it controls more central squares. When white plays in chess, when you make a pawn move, the pawn can no longer go back. So by playing c4, white's foregone the ability to put his pawn on c3 and control this d4 square. So in some sense, this is principled because now black tries to take full advantage of the control of this square, and he also controls another central square. That's fairly close. And I guess you also occupy this e5 square, which is also a central square. And as you know, controlling the center is the most important part of chess. One of the most important rules. So he plays knight c3. Like the general strategy here with the English is white will often play g3 and bishop g2. Well, this position itself, so I played knight f6 here. If black got an extra move now, like white just didn't get a move, this would literally be, if black played d5, this would literally be the open Sicilian. If you think about the Sicilian like this, e4, c5, knight f3. This is just the knight c6 Sicilian. So this is a reverse Sicilian system, but because white has an extra move, in normal systems of the Sicilian, you don't fianchetto the bishop, but since white has an extra move, normally you put the bishop here or something, or maybe here. But since white has this extra move, he often puts the bishop on g2, called fianchettoing the bishop, and this is based on the strategy of overprotecting these light squares in the center. So once the bishop's on g2, white will have excellent control of these two squares, because the knight controls these squares and the bishop controls these squares as well. Yeah, it's a fairly standard strategy, and then white, because the bishop will have, once the bishop gets there, it will have good control of this diagonal, so white will often try to attack on the queen side. But Nigel didn't go for this strategy, so I played knight f6. There are other ways to play this as well. You can play knight c6 and then f5 instead of knight f6. So Nigel now played e3. He's also played knight f3 before, and this is something I looked at before the game because I found this game in the database. This actually featured prominently in the recent World Chess Candidates tournament, which was won by Sergei Karyakin, who earns the right to challenge Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship. If not later this year, then next year. I'm not sure when the date is. So in that candidates tournament, I think this line with g3, which is the main line in the English opening after c4, e5, this line occurred multiple times. It occurred in two key games where Anand lost as black, and he might have even been able to win the tournament if he had not lost these games. So Anand played the black side with this, and he lost two key games in this line. And it actually featured in many other games in the candidates tournament as well, which is quite unusual because this is not that popular a line. I mean, lines where white starts off in the first move with e4 or d4 are way more popular than a line like this. Yeah, and then went for this bishop b4 strategy, which is similar to what I do in the game, but it's perfectly possible to play d5. So this is just like, if you know the Sicilian, this is like a dragon variation, where white has an extra move, basically. So black is playing the open Sicilian. But actually Nigel has played this move e3 before, which is also a Sicilian-like setup. Similar to before, black has two possible ways he can play. He can play bishop b4, or he can play d5. This is a more traditional, like, Sicilian setup. If black plays d5, white normally plays bishop b5 here to take advantage of the fact that he has an extra move. But if he wants, he can play this like a Sicilian and develop in the Scheveningen style. Something like that, I guess. I'm not too used to it because I don't play the Sicilian. So anyway, in this game, Nigel played e3, and he actually played the English opening, which is 1c4, against all the top boards. So I guess it was a way to avoid getting caught theoretically, because he doesn't have a chance to really prepare for his opponents, so he doesn't want to be caught in any of the latest theory. And this is kind of, the English opening is not so popular, so it's less theoretical. And even in this line, knight f3 is the main line, but he's played e3, which is a relative sideline. So I think d5 would be a fairly common way to play here, but I went for this approach with bishop b4. Now white plays knight ge2. And the point of this is, I was threatening to double his pawns, so bishop takes, he can now take back with the knight. So I castled, he played a3 to encourage me to give up my bishop. Now bishop e7 is a move here, but I played So black can maintain his bishop. We're taught, when we're beginners, we're taught that the value of knight and bishop are both about 3 pawns. But then later on you learn that the bishop is slightly better than the knight in most situations, so you don't give up the bishop. In general, you don't give up the bishop for a knight unless you get something in return. So even in a lot of modern theoretical variations, there's this theme where white might threaten, any player might threaten to trade a knight for a bishop, and the other player might just avoid it, and it looks confusing. But the reason is, in most situations, a bishop is considered worth slightly more than a knight. So here, to give up a bishop for a knight, you should have some reason for doing so, and the reason for black here is he's got extra development. He's castled already, so bishop takes, knight takes, and then he can hit quickly in the center with d5. You must have something in return for giving up the bishop for the knight. And what black has here is that after c takes d5, knight takes d5, he's the only player. He controls more of the center. He's faster developed. The king's already castled. His pieces are on his 4th rank, whereas white has no pieces on his 4th rank. So black controls more space in the center. The pawn controls these key squares. The knight controls key squares as well. So white plays queen c2. I guess this is to defend against this move. Knight takes, and then you can take with the queen instead of taking with the pawn. Or it's just, but probably more accurately, it's just the general flexible move. White will often adopt a Sicilian-like setup with something like this. So I played c5 here, and this is reminiscent of the Maroczy bind, named after Geza Maroczy. So that line might occur after, say, so in the Sicilian, it's often the way you use to play against Sicilians that don't involve e6, or Sicilians that involve an accelerated version of the dragon. So in this line, I think this is often common, c4, and then you get position kind of like this, with the pawn on c4, which mirrors the fact that I have a pawn on c5. With the pawn on c4, black can't play. It's harder to play this line because white now has excellent control of that b5 square with the pawn there. Also, the key central break where he plays e6 and d5 is made harder with the pawn there. So it's quite a lot of players like to play this system with the pawn on c4 called the Maroczy bind. It's a variation of the Sicilian, or it's a pawn structure that you find in the Sicilian. So I was studying Nigel's games in the database before we played this game, and he had played a line before where he played bishop e2. This was Short versus Grandelius in Malmo 2013. I think that's in Sweden. And that game went differently. I prepared this line involving knight c6, and it seemed like the position coming out of it was looking very nice for black. This is a very typical setup from the Maroczy bind. The pawn on c5 stops these key advances, well, along with black's other pawns. But the pawn on c5 is a particular feature of this position. Yeah, it looks like black has good development. He's compensated for having traded bishop for a knight with extra central control. He's the only person that has pieces on his own 4th rank. But Nigel played bishop d3 here, which he had never played before on the database. But thankfully I knew one game in this line, which was a game played by Morozevich, a famous Russian grandmaster. He's rated over 2700 for quite a long time. One of the best. It was definitely. It was probably. I'm pretty sure he was within the top 10. I don't think he is currently. No, he's not. He's not currently. So I played knight takes c3. This is a line that forces. I guess it forces a fix in the pawn structure. This is what. I mean, I didn't put too much thought into it because I was just following the Morozevich game, which is actually a bad way to play chess. You should think about why you play certain moves. Well, the thing here, I should point out that white can't play bishop takes h7 check, because as soon as he takes the knight, black's going to trap the bishop. It's not trapped yet, it has one square. Bishop comes here. But then after queen g5, it really is trapped. And you're even threatening to take the pawn on g2, so this is really bad. So Nigel played d takes c3, which also happened in the Morozevich game. Queen takes c3, it didn't actually look at before the game, but it even looks a little dangerous. You're attacking two different pawns, but you're not actually threatening to take anything because this bishop is being attacked, so you can't take any of the pawns on the next move. One line might go bishop e6, and now white can actually win a pawn. Bishop e4 attacks the pawn. When you defend this pawn, white's going to take one of these two pawns because it's a double attack. Effectively, it's a double attack. Black can play knight c6. He can also give up the pawn, which is actually quite a good gambit. Taking the pawn is actually a mistake. Black gets a strong initiative. Look at the bishop on c1, it's not developed and it literally can't move. All of black's pieces are developed. If white offers to trade pieces, this is actually good for black. So I guess queen takes, probably if queen takes queen, probably rook takes queen. So my board is frozen. Yeah. And the white bishop literally can't move. I mean, if given a few moves, black will probably play this d3 square. Looks very nice. The knight will probably come into here, and that'll actually freeze the bishop forever. Anyway, that was not a big deal. This has been played in the database before. I played f5 following Morozevich. You can also play h6, which is also a fine move. I mean, the pawn's being attacked, which is why black needs to react right now. So f5 blocks that diagonal. It's protected 2 times by the bishop and the rook, so it's well defended. So the Morozevich game actually went castles bishop e6. Franco Morozevich in Spain. Yeah, Morozevich, he ended up playing something like knight c6, and then he played a5 to stop white from playing b4, and he played something like queen g5 and rook a8, which probably wasn't the most accurate way to play, but it gave black good play. One of the main things is that white's bishop there is not very active. And of course black has the extra, as I keep emphasizing, he's the only person who has pieces on the 4th rank. So instead Nigel played d takes c3. Oh yeah, sorry, here he played d takes c3. f5. Instead Nigel here played e4. Actually bishop c4. Now on move 11 Nigel played e4. And I played f4, which I think is the only logical option here. You don't want to play g6 because white's just opened up this diagonal for the bishop. And he's just going to put the bishop there, and then he's going to play h4 to stop white from playing black from playing queen h4, and then he's got excellent control of this g5 square. And a move like queen f6 doesn't make sense either. White's just going to take the pawn, and it's going to leave black with an isolated pawn, which is bad in the long run. f4 is the only move that's consistent. And now we've reached a very unique pawn structure, and it's quite amusing to have done this so early in the game. I can't imagine how this kind of position would ever arise from any opening. Probably it's most similar to the exchange variation in the King's Indian defense, but even then black still has his dark squared bishop over here. And here we've traded it off, so this is quite a unique kind of position. Now, white continued bishop c4 check. I can't put anything in between, so I have to move my king. And now he played b4, which I thought was kind of a strange plan. In this kind of position, you probably don't want a castle kingside, because black's got this attack going. He'll probably start with f3 immediately, but he's also got a long-term attack with g5, g4, and all his pieces can kind of come in. His knight can come in. He can get his rooks involved as well, maybe rook to g7. So it's not very nice. So by playing b4, white completely weakens his king side, his queen side, so he can't castle there either, or at least not very easily. So yeah, I wasn't really sure. The engine thinks bishop d5 is a better move. Black can play queen e7. He wants to remove this very strong bishop in the center. It's like eyeing through black's camp. And there's like a dozen moves black can't make while that bishop's there. He can't play rook g8 to support his g5 pawn. He can't play rook f7. He can't play queen e6. He can't move this pawn. He probably doesn't want to move this knight there because the bishop can take it. So it's pretty annoying. So he wants to remove this bishop, and then black can play rook c8, knight c6, aiming to get the knight in here. But then after takes b3, white's slightly better because with the pawn this far advanced, it actually becomes weak. So if white comes in and takes this pawn, then this pawn will drop a lot of the time. So white has a slight advantage here. And my opponent played b4. And now I played knight c6, which is actually a mistake. a5 is very nice here, just undermining white's queenside and trying to open it up and make even more sure that white's not going to castle queenside. Queen e7 was also good here with the same idea. So if castles, then bishop e6. I was actually looking at ideas like this. I was actually more looking at putting the queen on f6 or b6, but the queen here is a bit more flexible. It can help protect the c5 pawn. I was worried about this move, queen b3, and now there doesn't look like much I can do other than takes. And now the queen here looks very strong. You can even move into this slightly stronger square d5 if I guess black can attack it there. So it looks very strong on this square, and there didn't seem to be a clear way black can dislodge the queen, but actually there is. You can play knight d7. He doesn't want to play knight b6 straight away because that pawn hangs, so you defend the pawn and then you play knight b6, and black's doing fine. It's equal. Instead I played knight c6 here, which I think is which I'm pretty sure is a mistake. Black doesn't want to commit his knight so quickly. With the knight here, it can't enter any of these two squares because of the white pawn on c3. But even before, black probably doesn't want to commit his knight either. If it comes here, then it's blocking the bishop. It's blocking this bishop. So then you'd want to move it away. Most logical square is f6. But the problem is white just plays f3, and now you can't come into any of these two squares, so it's kind of a mirror image as well. You don't want to commit the knight so early. Should note that taking the pawn isn't very strong. These pawns are doubled and isolated, so not worth very much, and in the long term black's going to be able to take this pawn back. Now my opponent played bishop b2, so the idea of playing b4 was so that the bishop has room. Now white can actually castle queenside eventually. he can't at the moment because black's queen controls this square and the king must go through that square, so it's not legal to castle queenside. So bishop b2 is actually a mistake. White should play f3 for a very specific reason, which I'm going to show in a moment. So if white plays this move, black can prepare the bishop to be traded off, but then white has an advantage. The advantage all has to do with the fact that this pawn's far advanced. If we were back here, it'd probably be a different situation, because this pawn would be easy to defend, but with the pawn far advanced, effectively this pawn is isolated. Normally we say isolated when there's no pawns in the files next to it, but effectively it's isolated. And it's weak to the attack in the long term. It's all about long term considerations here, because the pawn structure, there's so many pawns still left on the board and the position's fairly blocked. Bishop b2 is actually a mistake, and I have a very strong move here, which is f3. Now, I was thinking about this move a lot. It makes sense for white to respond g3, and now you play bishop h3. It prevents white from castling queenside because you're controlling one of the squares that the king must go through. And now I was worried about this move, queen d2, because you don't want to trade queens, because then this advanced pawn is just going to be weak in the long term. I mean, eventually it's just going to get attacked. And there'll be ways for white to pile up on that pawn, maybe move his king and move the other rook. It's just not nice, and black doesn't have any obvious way to use his other pieces to create counter. He can't take advantage of the fact that the pawn's very far advanced. It's controlling these two squares, but it's useless for black. So it's better to keep the queens on. And I hadn't looked this far. I thought, yeah, maybe bishop d5. The position's going to be blocked. Black can't use the d file because the bishop's blocking it. But then you open up the queen side, and the main factor of the position becomes the fact that the white king can't castle. It can't go to the king side, which is illegal. Can't go to the queen side because it's too open. So if c takes b4, keep trying to opening up the queen side. After queen b6, the pawn's being attacked. But if white takes it, then black's got a big attack. His queen's going to come in. It's threatening checkmate. If a takes b4, then a5 again. Black's got a slight advantage. White can't castle. He can castle, but it's not safe. Also in this particular position, that pawn would be attacked after he castles. So f3 was actually the best opportunity. Playing f3 now was the best opportunity in the game for me to gain an advantage. And I thought about it for a long time, but I really couldn't figure out a way for black to play after queen d2, so I thought white would be safe, and there weren't as many attacking opportunities as there actually are. So Nigel walked all the way around the simul tables, and by the time he came to me, I was still thinking about f3, so I just had to come up with an odd move on the spot because it didn't seem like f3 was good. So I played a6, which is not a good move. It somewhat threatens b5, but even then b5's not very strong. Now, my opponent should have played f3 again. And the point of playing f3 in all these lines is to stop me from playing f3. It's quite a concrete reason. Now, castles. Now he really can castle queenside. If not, he's just going to play queen d2 in the long term. Or he can castle kingside in some lines. Takes, rook e8, bishop e6. White's got a slight advantage, the rook's very strong. Instead on move 15, white plays My opponent played rook d1, which is slightly surprising because he's just gone to all this effort of developing his queenside pieces, and by playing this move he forgoes the ability to castle queenside. Nevertheless, it's still an okay move. I should have played queen h4 here. The reason for that is it leaves a pin on the white king, so he can't play f3, and then I can actually play my f3 idea later on. Or even more, or actually, no, it's better if, so the actual variation goes c takes a takes rook f6. So actually you don't want to play f3 too soon because it's too committal in this particular situation. It's better to attack with the rook first, and then black equalizes. I'll just double check why. So f3 is also an okay move. Engine saying it's okay, it's not great. Black will just have to retreat. So against rook d1 I played queen c7. And this is part of a long-term plan. I want to play b5 and c4, but as soon as I play b5, white's going to play bishop d5, and the knight will be unprotected, so I might as well just protect it straight away. Actually, it's not a very good plan, but I thought I was committed to this plan by playing a6. Actually, I'm not. I could have played 15 queen h4, which is a better move. Now my opponent plays f3, and actually knight e7 is a good plan here, for very technical reasons. But I ended up playing b5, bishop d5, c4. So now the style of the position has changed once again with all these pawn advances, and a general theme in this game is the fact that when you move pawns forward, they can't move backwards, and you're leaving space behind the pawns that become weak, and you're also leaving spaces adjacent to the pawns that become weak. It all started on move 1 when white played the English opening, and I was talking about how e5 was a principled response as it controls central squares. Well, now I've moved this pawn forward, and by making a pawn move like this, before the pawn controlled these two squares, and by moving the pawn forward, now I've weakened my control of these two squares, as well as the square that the pawn was on. And we'll see that white takes advantage of this with a plan that I saw pretty much instantaneously on move 15, because it's such an obvious plan. In fact, the move a4 is quite good here as well. It tries to undermine the pawn chain. Black can't move this pawn because then this pawn drops. White might aim to trade the pawns eventually, and then if he can somehow come around and win this pawn, then the other pawn will be really easy to pick off. Just as in, if white wins this pawn, then this pawn will become easy to pick off in the long term. Here, bishop d7 castles, white is slightly better, but black's not losing. My opponent played this other plan. He wants to invade with his queen on c5. This is the plan that I expected him to do, and I'd seen some moves ahead, and it looked like, well, definitely after move 15, black is playing for a draw now. There is no way. He's got no counterplay and no attack. The only thing he can do is try to trade off pieces and liquidate into an equal endgame. So I played bishop d7, and now again a4 is decent. Black can respond rook ac8. My opponent played queen c5, and now I played rook ac8. So I had seen all this. It looks very dangerous. In fact, I was talking about how I traded a bishop for a knight before so that I had more control of the center. I had pieces on my fourth rank, but now white's the one that's dominating, with two pieces completely within my camp. But on the other hand, black's position is solid. I mean, it's definitely a bad position, but the amazing thing is, in fact, a strong player might look at this position out of the blue and just say that black's losing. I'd probably say that as well if I saw this position. The only thing black has going for him is with these pawns here, white's bishop is blocked in, and he'll have to move quite a number of moves to get it out, which is in fact what he does in this game. Again, a4 was an idea, white castled, and now it turns out queen b8 was a very strong idea. The main thing here is that black now has this discovered attack on white's queen, and it can be quite strong. In some lines he's going to play rook f8 first. It covers the final escape square of the white queen, and then knight d4 unleashes the rook's attack on the queen, and the queen is trapped. So queen b8 was actually quite a strong move. I played knight b8, which is the plan I saw all the way back on move 15. And now it makes sense for white to trade queens here. Queen e7 isn't great. I mean, for one thing, black can just play rook e8. There's nothing. White doesn't have an attack on the king side, so his pieces aren't great there. I can just try to trade off pieces and alleviate my space disadvantage. So, but white's made all these moves with the queen, and now he just trades it for a queen that's just made one move. But you can play these moves if the resulting position you know is good for you for concrete reasons, and this is good for white. Now my opponent continued with this idea. He could also have played king f2, maybe with a focus on playing g3 and then playing on the queen side, which actually is quite a logical plan as well, because I can't make headway on. My headway is all based on the fact that I have some extra space on the king side. If white takes over, then he takes over on both sides of the board, because on the queen side I don't really have anything here. I don't have enough resources to play this and then take and then try to come in, because white will just play rook a1 and then he'll dominate, mainly because I can't even put another rook here because white's bishop attacks that square. He played bishop c1. Bishop c8 is an idea now, allowing the rook free. Actually, I use this idea later on. I was thinking about a5 during the game, with the purpose of stopping these a4 ideas once and for all. So black wants to play a4 and then just completely lock down the queen side. But actually white can just take, and it's very strong. Eventually there'll be a way, and then white's bishop will become free. He'll sacrifice a pawn and then the bishop will come out and cause all sorts of devastation. The two bishops really cause a lot of mayhem. In fact, it's often said that against the two bishops you should try to trade off one of the bishops. It's a recurring idea that the engine suggests, so you'd like to trade off one of these pairs of bishops, and it'll make the two bishops less strong, because with two bishops you can control the entire board. If you had another bishop here, you'd control everywhere. You control dark and light squares, but with one bishop it's a lot less strong. So I played g5 here, just trying to continue building up on my king side, extra space on the king side. This pawn wedge is really giving me a lot more space on the king side. I want to generate a long-term attack. Now my opponent played bishop d2. He wants to continue with this plan, which is quite logical. It's the only real plan that makes sense, especially with such little thinking time that my opponent has. And now I spent most of my time thinking about rook f6, which is actually the best move. black wants to eventually use the rook to help play g4, note that he can't use the rook here because the bishop attacks that square. And the engine quite likes king g7 followed by g4. Takes, rook g6. That was a better plan, but just for no reason whatsoever I changed my mind at the last minute when Nigel walked around to my board and played bishop c8, which is quite a bad way to play chess. You really should, you know, you're not having a great day when you don't back yourself and your ideas. This has its own plan of playing rook g7. It's a similar idea, but it's slightly weaker, I think. In the long term, with the bishop on d7, it's blocking the d file. So eventually white may have some tricky ideas. He'll move the bishop. He'll move this bishop to a8, where it's safe for a small amount of time. And then the rook will have access to d8. And this is particularly true if black moves his rook off of the back rank, and then the rook really can come to d8. And I do move my rook off the back rank, so that was not the best defensive decision. a4 is another idea again, but b takes a4 is strong now. You can put the bishop here and make it act like a big pawn. It protects these pawns, and in turn it's protected by its own pawn. Nigel continued rook bishop e1. I played rook g7. Again, rook f6 was a good idea. g4, very similar. Now, white can play a4, and the reason rook f6 was stronger was because of some very technical variations that come as a result of white playing rook a1 and then trading pawns and him coming down to the queen side. After g4, black's not losing, he's just slightly worse. My opponent continued with this plan, bishop f2. Now I played g4, and f takes g4 is a reasonable idea here. Normally you wouldn't consider taking the pawns as such a great idea, because if you trade pawns, you're giving up a pawn closer to the center for a pawn further away from the center, which is just generally bad for central control. You want to have pawns closer to the center. And as you know, central control is an important theme in chess. But it makes sense in some of these situations because it opens up the position somewhat for white's bishops, and black is fairly passive. He doesn't have a clear way of continuing his attack. I mean, there's quite a lot of defensive resources for white. He can just move his bishop and defend his pawn. Black was slightly worse in that position. Now Nigel played king h1. He doesn't like the tactics. I was threatening to take the pawn. He doesn't like the fact that the rook's aiming at the king. Now h5 is a good move here. And black's just slowly preparing for white's entrance onto the queen side. There's no obvious way for black to attack here, which is actually why this position's so hard to play as black. I played rook f6. Now, rook a1 was the best move. Trying to play a4. The reason for rook f6 was I want to maybe sometimes put double on the g file. Well, it was my intention actually to double on the g file. Turns out it's not the strongest plan. My opponent played rook d2, which actually isn't necessary because I don't have any strong threats. It looks menacing. I want to double and then maybe take the pawn and then maybe move my bishop in, but it actually isn't necessary to do that straight away. Now I played g takes f3. Actually h5 is a very interesting idea. You don't want to play rook g6. right now because white simply takes and then tries to open up the queen side. H5 is an idea, and let's just say white doesn't make a move. The long-term plan is to continue knight d7, knight b6, well, sorry, king h7, knight b6, and now I'm finally giving white some moves. G3 and then takes, h4. Black's got a big attack now, and he's actually better. The funny thing is, if you don't play king h7, things actually go wrong. You play knight b6, takes, h4, rook takes e5. This check becomes annoying. I think that's the reason. Oh, okay, no, it's not the check. It's just that the bishop comes here and it's lined up against your king and two rooks at the same time, which is very annoying. I decided to trade off. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Certainly I was afraid of white taking the pawn and creating opening up the position that way. So I played g takes f3, which is actually a good move. G takes f3. Now it turns out knight d7 was the strongest way to play here. The idea is black wants to play knight b6 and eventually trade off the bishop, eliminate one of the bishops, and it'll ease the space disadvantage that black has. But when you have a space disadvantage, you always trade off pieces, so then your pieces have more room to move. In fact, knight d7 pretty much equalizes the game, which is surprising because white has so much extra space and the bishop is so dominating. I had to make all these weird moves. I couldn't put my rook on g8, I couldn't put that rook on g8. I had to make these weird moves, like rook f6 just to play rook g6. Now I played bishop h3, which forces rook g1, but bishop h3 wasn't the strongest plan. The reason it forces rook g1 is because if it moves anywhere else, you got this check, and then you take the pawn with check as well from the black rook. Rook g1, and now black actually doesn't have time for that knight d7 idea anymore with knight b6 because of the tension on the g file. White plays rook d1, which is surprisingly strong, knight b6, bishop b7, and the point here is you can't take that bishop because rook d8 check is going to lead to checkmate. So instead I played rook takes g1 check. Now of course white does not play king takes g1 because rook g6 check, the king has to go back to h1, and then you play bishop g2 check, bishop takes f3 check. So white must play bishop takes g1. And now Nigel completely surprised me by offering a draw, which I accepted the next time he walked around the tables. And it was quite a nice time for Nigel to offer a draw as well. I was actually intending to play, well, when Nigel offered the draw, I still hadn't figured out a plan here. So as Nigel walked around and I was still considering the draw, considering whether I had any chances in this position, I found this plan of bishop f1. The most annoying thing for black in this position is he has to contend with the idea of white moving his bishop and then the rook coming and invading in, which looks completely lost if white can do that, although actually it turns out it's much more complicated. Black has more defensive resources than I thought. So I was thinking about this move bishop f1. Black wants to anchor this bishop on d3 and just completely seal off the d file, and then if white tries to come to the g file, then black can just block. It's not a big deal. Now, bishop c5 is the best move here, but I was trying to find a forced variation that might lead to white winning material, because I think if white wins either of these two pawns, black's done for immediately, because subsequently he's going to either lose the other pawns in the pawn chain or the other pawns on the queen side in the pawn chain. So if I could find one forced variation where white could win material, then it's obvious that this whole thing is completely hopeless, and black should accept the draw immediately. And so bishop a7, I was looking at this variation with bishop a7, so white wants to come in here and try to take these pawns, but first he forces black to defend his knight. And now in fact it's better to actually move the knight, which looks scary because it's right in front of the bishop. It's right in the eye of the rook, and it looks like white can just move his bishop and then take the knight. It turns out it's more complicated than that. I was just looking at rook f8, and now, well, let me show you what black can do if so. Oh yeah, of course, yeah, black can just play bishop d3 and seal off the file. So you don't want to. So knight d7 was a good move. I was thinking about rook f8. This is the variation I was looking at during the game. Now bishop c5 is again a good move, but a better move. But I was thinking about bishop b7. The idea is black's going to undermine the defender of the pawn on a6. He's going to take the knight first, remove the defender, and then take the pawn. So now, well, he's at the same time, by moving his bishop, he's trying to move his rook in and attack the pawn further. So black should seal the file closed. And now I was looking at the variation bishop takes b8, which is actually a blunder. Much stronger is rook g2, knight d7, bishop c5. Black can't take the bishop because the pawn would be too far close to, it would be too close to the queening square. And basically black's going to find it very hard to defend his pawns. This is completely winning for white. But instead I was looking at bishop takes b8, removing the defender to the pawn, rook takes b8, and now actually bishop d5 is the best move in this position. Bishop takes a6 is actually a very bad move. Not a blunder, it's more of a one single question mark. And now I was looking at the line rook b6. Actually much stronger is just rook a8, giving up the second pawn, because then this pawn cannot be defended. And then once you take that pawn, then you come back and try to take this pawn, because that pawn's also hard to defend for white. Well, sorry, no. To be more accurate, you take the pawn and then white will play rook b2, so it stops you from playing rook b3. Take the pawn, and then you give a check, you try to move your bishop out of the way, and then you just push your pawn, because your pawn's much closer to the end. In fact, black's better here. He's just going to try to push the pawn and make a queen. Rook b6. I was looking at rook b6 on move 34. I was just trying to find a variation that was a forced win for white. If there wasn't a forced win for white, then black at least has some hope. And here I was looking at bishop c8, but it turns out I completely missed this idea. Bishop takes b5 is an amazing sacrifice. Rook takes b5, a4, a5, rook a2. The big idea is the bishop, because of this very locked pawn structure, the bishop is going to find it very hard to move all the way back and try to defend everything. White's pawns are too far advanced. He's just going to steamroll black, and white is clearly better here. It's quite an amazing sacrifice. Only possible because of the locked pawn structure. I was only looking at bishop c8, and now rook b8, trying to go for a repetition. The bishop moves back, rook moves back to b6. Now I missed this move. In fact, black's probably still doing okay. I only saw bishop e6. So the point is, when black goes for this other pawn, white's just going to take this one. Or more accurately, he's going to defend the pawn first. Because if he takes, then we'll just go back to the other variation. The one that I just showed was slightly better for black. And after rook a2, then black has time to defend his pawn again, but then white breaks through on the queen side. And once he breaks through, then he'll have control of the a file, which is devastating. So rook b8. Instead, I only saw bishop e6. Now king g7 is a better move, but then I was looking at this line. You attack the rook has to move. Bishop c2, and now the bishop controls the square. So it's as if black doesn't have that extra pawn. And it looked like I was okay. But then bishop, it looked like I was okay, but then white can force this variation, and this position is obviously, if anything, white has the chances. So it's obvious that black should accept the draw if white has this variation that forces black into a pawn down position with no winning chances whatsoever. In fact, white even has a way to gain the advantage here. You can play bishop d7, black has to defend the pawn, and now he can't play rook d1 because the bishop controls that square. He has to play rook a2 and then move to d2, but this is good for white. He has time to invade. White's clearly better. So in the position where Nigel offered me a draw, it's quite obvious white is better here. So why would my opponent offer a draw? Well, it's a 30 board simul. There were quite a few boards still going. It looked like this position, I mean, I'd already defended for like the last 15 moves or something, and it looked like this position would be difficult to convert into a winning position, especially with just a few seconds to think about all of your moves. White would have to come up with a very clear plan here to try to win material. So it makes sense. You're expected to concede a few draws in a simul, and in a simul against strong players. So it makes sense to offer the draw, I guess, just to conserve energy. Some of the other boards were also giving him some trouble as well. But it's clear that white's better here. The two bishops are really strong. Finally, white's bishop is free. And they control like half the board. Once the other bishop goes to c5, they control like half the board. All these open lines everywhere. So actually I was looking at bishop f1, and in fact I was going to play bishop f1, which is not a great move. Thankfully I got bailed out by the draw offer. But if I were to play on, so I accepted the draw because there's no active plan here for black. There's no obvious way to try to play for a win. And white already had that variation that forced pretty much the draw, but it was actually a better position for white anyway. He could have forced the draw, but he has winning chances as well, which is even worse. And I have no winning chances. In fact, a better move was king g7. So the idea here is that black wants to play rook d6 followed by bishop e6. Rook d6, king f6, and then bishop e6, because you don't want to play bishop e6 straight away. Bishop c5 was going to be annoying, attacking the rook. And now the engine gives two variations: bishop c5, knight d7. There's actually this variation that almost pretty much forces black to lose a pawn. But then, miraculously, he's doing okay at the end of the day, because white's not white probably has to come and defend this pawn. Otherwise he loses too many of these pawns. And black somehow gets out alive in this kind of position. d5, rook takes. Somehow, well, this is quite good for white, actually. So even this position is quite good for white. The other idea is, so rook f6. There's ways for black to create counterplay. Another variation is bishop b7, rook f7. This one, yeah, this one's worse because this one's worse for white because black actually maintains the material balance. And with the rooks traded off, he doesn't have to worry about these open files. So he's doing decently here. He's still slightly worse. But yeah, that variation, the one bishop c5 was strong. Because you have these variations, white's bishops are just crawling all over black's position. And sooner or later it's going to force the winner material. This move forces black to defend this pawn. But then there's no other good way to defend the pawn because white invades. Play something else that forces more concessions. So thankfully Nigel offered a draw in his position, and I realized that it was quite a good situation to accept it. So then I accepted it the next time Nigel walked around and we shook hands, and I was very proud to have drawn a game against one of the greatest players, well, the third ranked player in the world a few decades ago, but still within the top 100 players, which is quite a nice achievement, even though he's completely underpowered when he's playing in a simul.